Yeah. The patient is admitted in our hospital on day 6. While admission, he was alert. Tachypneic respiration rate of 22, 32 per minute. Room saturation at room air 85%. And he had bilateral lung crackings. He was started on oxygen at 5 liters in face mask, normal heparin, and dexamethasone. On day 8, his RT-PCR for COVID is positive. Started on injection remdesivir, and he has escalated to 10 liters of oxygen in our non-rebreathing mask. Next slide. On day 10, his condition progressively deteriorated. His saturation was dropping, was connected to the continuous positive airway pressure ventilation with a FA out of 90% with the positive and expiratory pressure of 12. His arterial blood gas showed a partial pressure of oxygen at 55 and the carbon dioxide at 32. He has continued to deteriorate for a few more days and then gradually improved. On day 31, he de-escalated from the continuous positive airway pressure to high flow nasal oxygen at 40 liters per minute with the FA of 90%. On day 42, again, very nicely, he was de-escalated from HFNO to non-rebreathing mask with 12 liters, and he started on antifibrotic drugs and supported with N-acetylcysteine also. And then from the NRM mask, he was de-escalated to nasal pharynx at 2 liters per minute. And then he was not able to, intermittent oxygen was required. So was connected to the 2 liters of oxygen concentrated. He required a minimal oxygen intermittently. He was discharged with 2 liters of oxygen. With the oxygen concentrators was given to him by our hospital, and asked to have the oxygen intermittently whenever necessary. He was weaned off. He was given a telemedication and telecommunication counseling was done, and he was weaned off from the oxygen from the home itself on day 80. Next slide. His investigations were on the day of 23rd of May. His CRP is 45. It's gradually increased to 148. And the recovery is nicely came down to 4.7 on the 7th July of this July 3rd. His NLR initially 29, on recovery time it went down to 4. Radiology 60% lung changes. It worsened to 95% of the lung involvement and then gradually improved. At the time of discharge, he has still had a lot of lung post-COVID sequelae was there, and he was discharged with the sequelae findings. Next slide. So he was offered a multidisciplinary treatment. Actually, a psychiatric opinion on bi-weekly basis because suddenly he developed some sort of anxiety. He became very nervousness, agitated, and had persistent tachycardia. He was evaluated for tachycardia. His echocardiogram was normal. He was started an anxiolytic. Actually, we are given him alprazolam. He responded very well to alprazolam. And then his nutrition was given high protein nutrition with good calories, with the vitamin and multivitamin supplements. Mineral supplement was given periodically. He was given physiotherapy for chest active and passive, and he was given limb physiotherapy because he was not ambulant for nearly 1 month. Next slide. In the post-discharge follow-up, he was given teleconsultation and counseling was done. In fact, he was given a pulse oximeter to him. We asked him to take the photograph of the pulse oximeter and send it to the WhatsApp. So we are daily virtual assessment of vital parameters was done by a very senior person, professor of our hospital, and his daily activities were monitored, and he was communicating through voice messages as he was not able to read. So what happens is we are able to read the voice messages. From the voice message itself, we are able to identify how fast, is there any difficulty in speaking through the letting the voice messages. We are able to identify his respiratory distress and all very easily through that. His hospital visit, every 15 days he made a hospital visit. He had a financial issue because he was not, he is from very poor background. He received help from the sponsors we arranged, and he used to send all the photos like riding in the bike and playing carom, and all these recreational activities are you sent to through WhatsApp. Next slide. So in total, it's a psychological assessment has to be done. Very important at the very earliest. So in fact, we have to do all the things when the patient is getting admitted. We have to make an advanced care planning. And whenever necessary, the patient becomes a little bit agitated and other things, the psychological assessment has to be done. What we have done for this patient also, In fact, the psychiatrist said the counseling was done every week for him. Psychological counseling to the patient and the family members was done. If necessary, psychotropics has to be added. So it becomes very important that the palliative care and an integral component of the management of the COVID patients is very, very essential. It determines and see the management of the patients in a right way. Thank you. Next slide.
Hello, everyone. COVID pandemic posed great challenge to the entire mankind. Our system was not an exception. We also had a lot of challenges. To summarize the challenges which we faced, it can be dealt with under 3 headings, namely challenges faced by the system, challenges faced by the family, and finally challenges faced by the patient himself. Next slide. There was a rapid surge in the number of COVID patients. So it was a huge task to increase the infrastructure proportionately. Particularly during the first week, we never knew the pace of increase in the enormity of the problem. So we had to anticipate and quickly respond to that. And we had to expand the number of beds, the infrastructure, the manpower, and we had to procure huge amounts of machines and gadgets in a mammoth proportion. All that was a huge challenge. Particularly, we had to deploy a huge number of medical and paramedical persons. During the peak, about 1,050 doctors and double this number of paramedical staff had to be put into COVID care. That was a big challenge. And all the more it was challenging that the doctors were of diverse specialties. And temporarily, they all had to unlearn their subspecialty, and they have to focus and they have to come under a single umbrella of COVIDology. That required a lot of conditioning on their system. And special challenge was procurement of PPEs and other consumables of mammoth quantity for taking care of such a huge number of patients. Next slide. A special challenge was a huge increase in the requirement for oxygen. Our hospital's existence of 365 years, we have never come across such a huge requirement of oxygen to the tune of 46 metric tons on a single day during the peak of second wave. Normally, the requirement used to be 7 to 8 metric tons in the pre-COVID times. And we had to, our hospital provided free food and water for all the inpatients. And that was another challenge, particularly during the lockdown, which was imposed during the first wave of the disease. It posed a special challenge. We had to make a lot of arrangements for that. And as our protocol, all the medical and paramedical staff were doing 1 week cycle of duty, and followed by that 1 week of quarantine. We had to make quarantine facilities for these paramedical staff and medical staff as well. Next slide. And for the family, it was a nightmarish experience, particularly if the breadwinner of the family is involved and the guarded prognosis of the condition put them into tremendous emotional and psychological perturbations. A special challenge was they wanted to be near the patient, but when they do so, there was a fear of getting infected. At the same time, if they decided to stay away from the patient, a sense of guilt engulfed them. They were put in a state of mental conflict. It was very obvious in the first wave of the pandemic. And again, as I've already said, most of our patients belong to low and low middle income families and a lot of economic uncertainties that were prevailing upon their minds. Next slide. And for the patient, there was no time to get reconciled to the catastrophic illness they have been afflicted with. It came as a sudden surprise. And that too, getting admitted in COVID ICU ward, which is an alien atmosphere in the midst of several critically ill patients, that posed a huge emotional challenge for them. And particularly the patients who were on CPAP and high oxygen support, the fear of impending death was writ large on their faces. And those who had to stay for a longer time in the hospital had special problems. And particularly, there were challenges related to the poor nutrition for a long time. And that made them physically infirm. that added to their challenge. And more importantly, even those who recovered from the illness, there was a lot of uncertainties and apprehension because of that, related to the health status and the job, whether it will be there and they will be losing the job, etc. And a special challenge was, particularly during the first wave of the pandemic, there was a lot of stigma, social stigma attached to the disease. And fortunately, with the repeated counseling and all that, and that vanished during the second wave. So that's this particular pandemic. It was not just a medical crisis, it was a huge psychological and emotional crisis as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that case presentation. It highlights many of the themes that we heard from Dr. Wu. And as we've talked about before, the breakdown of the effects of COVID on not just the individual patient, but all of the people around them, the family members, the providers, the system. We obviously are a little bit behind due to some of our technical difficulties, but I do want to get to a couple of questions that have come up, and we'll leave it to sort of the case presenters to help us with sort of this first question, which, as you mentioned, that patients often feel alienated in the hospital. They're alone. This patient was in the hospital for 30 plus days on high flow nasal cannula until he started getting a little bit better with regular nasal cannula. What strategies do you find most successful in sort of combating that feeling of being alone, particularly when we're worried about infectivity, visitation, and how do we make a connection or make this patient feel like they are still connected with their families? What is the best strategy for that?
Actually, we created a help desk. The help desk, what we do is they tend to receive the information from the treating team about the patient details, and then very particularly about the critically ill patients. They used to get the help desk used to get all the details from the treating room, and they will communicate to the attenders. That's the one that was very, very effective was initially. And apart from that, what we do is, suppose they have any doubt on that update of that particular information, we had a separate mobile line, specifically for communication to the attenders and other general public, so that they can contact through that line. So any information that needed, we will resolve them, or we will update them about particularly. And if still they have any doubts, we can ask them to come to that ward with a particular PPE kit, and especially critical care patients. We give them a PPE kit, we take them to the patients, and then we can explain to them, understand them. We will tell them about what are the modality of the treatment to the patients and other things we do. I think this is the way, the best way. Apart from this, we had volunteers from the colleges. They are licensing officer between the patient and the attenders, the patient and doctors. And this is very, very helpful for us because they tend to communicate, licensing between the patient and the attenders and doctors also. This, I think, this is a very best tool that we have found very effective, especially in the first year we learned it, second year really we executed it to the code.
Thank you for that. I think that's exactly right. We found the same thing here, that regular communication is most important. And then there's so many barriers to communication, and you do need that extra effort, extra resource to be able to even give what you would consider to be our standard communication because of the fear, because of the PPE, because of the resource constraints. And it's such a challenge because in a state where we're behind, we want to bring more resources. So I completely appreciate that. One other question that I have that comes up frequently is the communication strategy, particularly for the very sick, critically ill patient. There is so much information, so much data, so many details, and a certain amount of unknown about prognosis and what will happen, particularly day to day. So as all of these communications are happening with patients and their loved ones, what have you guys found as a successful strategy in terms of how much information to give and how best to frame that information? And Dr. Gopal Krishnan, I think this would be good for you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that is a real issue. Actually, patient's family was very anxious to know about the prognosis and so on. What we followed up is that the most important strategy is that to be realistic. neither to give false hopes, not to frighten them with more returns. And again, the details about the patient, the extent of the details of the patient, it was not uniform because we could identify who can take it in the right sense, who can really understand. That is based on, there are a lot of determinants for this, their social status and their educational status and their emotional status. If they were in a fit mood of mind to understand exactly, we went ahead giving all the finer details. In some patients' families who cannot really understand, we didn't load them with more information. So we were, the brevity was a better strategy over there. But a single point is that we wanted to be realistic via media between false hopes and then giving a frightening information.
I think that's exactly what we try and do as well. That is so important to be realistic, but also to understand that each patient, family member, they have different backgrounds, different degrees that they would want to understand and what they're ready to be receptive to, which I think is highlights some of what Dr. Wu had said, that if you look at all of the strategies that he talked about, a lot of them almost, they all start with sort of understanding the patient and their story before you jump in with your information and all the details. And so when you understand what their background is, where they're coming from, it helps convey that information successfully. I think we have just 3 more minutes. I want to get to one more question, which is something a little more practical and speaks to, again, something that came up in the evidence-based review, is that we know that breathlessness, anxiety, and agitation are very common in our COVID patients. And so what I'm hoping to get from you both is sort of what parameters do you use to identify breathlessness and anxiety and agitation and know when it's worth treating that specific symptom versus whether it's something more systemic going on that you need to address. And if there are specific markers that you use in the clinical context to identify this breathlessness and anxiety.
Yes, actually, very commonly we encounter anxiety is the most important thing that we have noticed. Restlessness sometimes. They sometimes become very agitated also. So this is the most commonest psychological problems that we have encountered. Before treating, we try to find out the possible other medical causes. We have to rule it out also. That we gradually rule it out. But once we rule it out, it's better. What we do is for anxiety and other problems, we used to give some benzodiazepines like lorazepam or alprazolam or anxiolytic drugs. We feel it's very beneficial to the patients. The other one for us, breathlessness. So once you know the patient is very agitated and breathlessness, we can give a morphine or opioid groups. This is very, very useful, but in a very controlled dose. Looking at the saturation levels, respiration rate, and the depression level, all these things, I think that group really works well, and it really alleviates that dyspnea associated. The patients, if very comfortable, I think we can continue that for some time being, and that will be very, very beneficial. Some patients we encounter with delirium also. Of course, those kind of patients we can give haloperidol. It's a much better drug that we can try. In those cases, haloperidol can be tried. So these are especially we come across the anxiety and then especially the breathlessness and then the delirium conditions we have come out with. Sometimes before this, some patients may need after the intubation also some end stages. Yes, once we know that there is no hope for the patients to come around, I think the morphine and sometimes even going to the level of fentanyl and propofol also sometimes very, very useful when the end stage, really end stage is there. I think we have to take a call on that, make the patients pain-free for this one. I think this is a much better approach for the anxiety and other things.
Yes, no, I agree. Well, I want to thank you both and Dr. Wu so much for taking the time, presenting a wonderful case, giving us a fantastic evidence-based review for a very important aspect of care for our COVID patients and really sort of all our sick patients. I want to give a quick plug. Sorry, I'm going to run through these slides really quickly. For our next session, which will be the rational use of oxygen on September 30th, we're very much looking forward to that. We will have our pulmonary expert, Dr. Roy Brower, as part of the expert panel and giving the evidence-based review. And I think with that, it is 9:30. And so I want to be very respectful. We love to end on time. So I thank you all for being here. I think if there are questions in the chat, we will incorporate those and make sure that we have our resource document available to send out to all of those who registered. to sort of summarize and again give you a reminder as well as some resources on best practices in palliative care and COVID-19 management.